My name is Israel Shapiro. I am one of the Gabaim in the McDonald's Shul. I wish to tell you about the uniqueness of this video covering the story of my father, Moshe Shapiro Zal, and his brother Meir Shapiro Zal. So sad as the story is, as terrible as the experiences of the Shapiro brothers were, it is unique and overwhelming. Unique and overwhelming because our family and friends did everything they could to search for and find evidence documenting the way to freedom, because as we heard the story firsthand from our father and uncle, the second generation and the third generation could rely only on us to tell them the story, and that is not firsthand, so we would like to have some evidence and documentation to supplement our stories. Usually, all thanks and credits are given at the end of a movie, but we have good reasons to start with our deepest appreciation to all these people and institutions for their help and assistance, which reached far beyond our expectations. His Excellency the Ambassador of Switzerland to Israel, the head of the manuscript department of the Zurich Central Library, as well as a specially commissioned librarian at the Zurich Central Library. The state archivist of the National Archives and the Cultural Office at the National Archives of the Principality of Liechtenstein. Several unnamed friends who have opened the doors to unique documents. Professor Peter Geiger, historian, Liechtenstein. The General Secretariat of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Switzerland. The Archive for Contemporary History of the ETH, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich. The story begins with my grandfather. My grandfather, Rabbi Israel Shapiro, I was named after him, was a rabbi in a small town in Poland called Freepik. He was a true Zionist who craved to come to Eretz Israel. This picture you see was taken when he entered the ghetto in later years. This is how the small villages looked like. This is the marketplace. Transportation means bringing people from village to village, where as you see. My grandfather tried in many ways to get himself and his family to Israel, but British mandate policy prohibited Jewish immigration. He wrote to the Eretz Israel Rabbinate a personal letter to Rav Kook, but the letter was not delivered. Meanwhile, hoping that someday he would get the certificate, my grandfather practiced agriculture, hoping to become a farmer here in Israel, and my father used to help him with that. Also, he had saved some money and bought gold coins, which he thought of using for his immigration to Eretz Israel. And then came the war, and the family was sent to the Radom ghetto. Here you can see the ID forms for the ghetto. And this was the reality in the Radom's ghetto. My father, who was, as I said, 16 and a half, was taken to work in a nearby German army depot. And he was the only one who was able to bring food to the family. This went on from 1939 to 1942. But all along the time, Jews started to feel what the future would be. And my grandfather also sensed the same. And told him to take care of his brother and sister. Towards autumn of 1942, the Germans liquidated the ghetto, sending 18,000 Jews to Treblinka, including my grandparents and my aunt. Remained were my father and his younger sister and brother. My father, true to his promise to his father, kept an eye on his brother and kept him with him until the end of the war, and also, whenever he could, sent clothes and food to my aunt, his sister, using a gold coin whenever he saw necessary. Now I will tell you a bit about my father, Moshe Shapiro Zal. My father was born in Poland, and he was 16 and a half years old when the war broke out. For 5.5 years, he was being sent from one German labor camp to another with unspeakable suffering, and all the time struggling for survival and taking care of his younger brother who was with him. When I was young, I seldom heard anything of what he went through. That was the period when, struggling to build a normal life and family, survivors tried to forget or at least suppress memories. 5 years of ceaseless struggle, keeping alert, constantly on guard, did not leave much space for less important memories. His ID card showed his date birth as May 1st, 1924. About my uncle, Meir Shapiro. As I said, he was just 14 years old or less when the war broke, and he was quite short and looked young also. When the group were sent to Auschwitz and stood there at the selection of Dr. Mengele, my father looked and perceived that there is a selection and Mengele is sending those who look able-bodied to one side and those who look weak to the other side. He grabbed my uncle, put him between himself and another guy who was tall, told my uncle to stand with his wrists next to his body, and they took him upward so he would look taller, and that's how we passed the selection to the right side. After the passing away of my father, the family, all next of kin, gathered together for the traditional Jewish period of mourning, which lasts for 7 days and is called Shiva, and in which the family is having a memorial for the deceased person. During that time, our uncle, who was also next of kin to my father, sat together with us, and we asked him to give us some stories on their escape from a death march. A story which we had only heard a few details about. And here is what my uncle told us.
On April 26, 1945, we were assembled and marched out of Dachau on a death march towards Salzburg. En route as night fell, we stopped near a village and were told to sleep in the barns. Our SS guard, with whom our father had become friendly, took us, a group of 10, to the barn on the farther side of the village. Hide in the barn and don't come out tomorrow morning. I will make sure that no one notices your absence. Then, when we have disappeared, go in this direction." He pointed with his hand to the Swiss border. "I heard that they allow refugees in." "We did just that," said my uncle. "The others were murdered by the Germans when they reached Austria." We went for 3 days, and on May the 1st, on reaching a border gate, we were allowed into Switzerland.
My father gave that testimony in the Spielberg project of gathering testimonies from Holocaust survivors. And in that testimony he said that he remembers still the train station in Feldkirch with its huge propaganda banner saying "One people, one empire, one leader."
וכך הלאה. למחרת הגענו לעיר פלדקירch, שזה 30 קילומטר.
We walked all day and through the night, and on the next day reached the town of Feldkirch, some 30 kilometers from the Swiss border. I asked there for directions from the town's authorities and led the group to the mayor's office. I understood and spoke fluent German. At the mayor's office, I declared that we are a group of refugees about to cross the border into Switzerland, where the Red Cross is waiting to meet us, and asked for some food. The mayor gave us food stamps to be used at the local restaurant, which happened to be the only decent restaurant in the area and was frequented by German army officers. The restaurant owner served us a meal and we sat to eat. At the tables near us sat German army and SS officers eating their lunch. One SS officer came over and told us to go away if we do not wish to have a sad end. We finished our lunch and went back to the mayor, who gave us tickets to the train, and we rode the train to the Swiss border. I do not remember if it was that same day or the next. We arrived at the border, but the border was closed. I was very sick, and my friends had to carry me to the gates. The place was full of refugees who waited to cross the border, but upon seeing us and our condition, they gave us way.
It was Friday, May 1966. Next day would be my bar mitzvah celebration. At noontime, last preparations were being done and my father was checking that I know my Torah reading. In a moment's impulse, I asked him, which was your bar mitzvah portion? His answer, with a shy smile, was, I do not remember. My mother, shocked, asked, don't you remember when you started laying tefillin? My father stopped in his tracks and answered her in a slow and agitated manner. We did not know if and how we shall survive the next 2 minutes. But I asked, it says in your ID card that you were born on May 1st, 1924. That is not for memory, said my father. That is because I was reborn on May 1st, 1945. In the year 2014, I received a whole dossier containing a very detailed 9 pages long testimony which my father had given to the Jewish authority in Switzerland. At this time, we had no reason to ask permission for publishing it. My uncle had said that they had been the first death march group of Jewish concentration camp inmates to reach Switzerland, and that their story had made the headlines in the newspapers at that time. I had tried to trace and retrieve some newspaper reports from that date, May 1st, 1945. A great deal of initiative and dogged persistence, and considerable local knowledge and influence helped to track this story down. Not only were detailed questionnaires needed to be completed and submitted, but also the empathy, goodwill, and motivation of local professional experts were procured to find the needle in the haystack. For various reasons, many Swiss media have transferred parts of their own archives worth preserving to the cantonal or local central archives. Our many contacts referred us to the Central Library of Zurich, one of the largest archives in Switzerland. and this is how we ended up there. The case of the 9 prisoners was so interesting to the head of the special manuscript department that a librarian was specially assigned for several weeks to search for possible cuttings. On the 17th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we were surprised with an email and 2 press cuttings. Before I show the cuttings, I would like to show you the place in the archives where one cutting was found. I will give you now a short English overview of the contents of the newspaper. Headline says, "The situation at the Liechtenstein border, books, May 2nd. The refugees accumulate in always larger numbers at the Vorarlberg-Liechtenstein border in Scharnwald. The Swiss border guards who are in overall control have a huge work to do. It is estimated that up to 3,000 members of all levels seek admission. After the crossing, Liechtenstein Boy Scouts provide the first food, and among them is Princess Georgina in a work apron and headscarf. She is distributing Ovomaltine and soup to the starving ones and has been actively working for days with the relief agency from early morning to late evening. The most shattering image one got to see here so far was the arrival of 9 Polish Jews from the concentration camp of Dachau. Their condition was such that they literally had to be carried over the border. Near the border, they were moved into a cradle where they collapsed, totally exhausted. Princess Georgina gave them the first strengthening, whereas she had to give these poorest people food like small children. The image of this poorest of all was so striking that you cannot put it in words." The content of the second cutting of the Zurich daily Tages-Anzeiger is more or less the same but much shorter. Fact was that these were the initial pieces of evidence that pretty much mirrored what our father and uncle told us as children. These have helped us to know and understand my father's and uncle's early life and have given our families peace and closure. For a while I was satisfied with that, but some years later I became more ambitious and curious. For today's Yom Hashoah memorial celebration, this story, among others, was chosen to be made into a film. Film means many pictures, movements, etc., and that's why it was decided to look for more footage. Through a close-knit network of contacts, friends with their connections managed to get in touch with Professor Peter Geiger, a historian in Liechtenstein, who published a book entitled Wartime about the Principality of Liechtenstein during the war years and published articles in other media outlets. Professor Geiger sent us excerpts from his book, where he describes in detail the history of the 9 concentration camp inmates. He also gave us references to articles that had appeared in the Liechtenstein press. Professor Geiger was the first one to show us pictures of the group after they crossed the border. It was therefore the first time that my family had picture proof of how the group of the 9 concentration camp inmates looked immediately after the death march. And to discover this nearly 80 years later. Imagine the emotions that these 2 pictures evoked. You see the pictures, the caption in English. The top one, a picture of a liberated concentration camp prisoner, which is fed by Princess Gina at the border of Scharnwald. At the bottom, picture, liberated concentration camp prisoners are taken from Scharnwald to books in Switzerland. Professor Geiger also thankfully referred us to the Liechtenstein National Archives, enabling us to obtain further evidence. And this is what we received this year on February 16, 2022. Amazing, amazing. Unique black-white pictures of the group at the Scharnwald border in Liechtenstein. And a 50-minute film which contains a very short sequence about Princess Gina, who took it upon herself to care for the refugees. And here are some pictures from the movie. My father and his friends of the group were then transferred to the Books border in Switzerland. It also says that the Swiss General Guisan arrived to visit the absorption center. General Guisan was the commander-in-chief of the Swiss army. Switzerland only appoints a general in times of war. The team of the National Archives of the Principality of Liechtenstein had made a huge effort and helped us considerably in processing the history of Moses and Meir Shapiro with pictures. Therefore, we thought that perhaps similar material could also have been archived in Switzerland. We contacted His Excellency, the Swiss ambassador to Israel, who found our story heartbreaking and spontaneously offered his assistance. He succeeded in targeting the right places for research. On February 18, 2022, we received very comprehensive documentation with the following context. These 3 pictures of my father and his group taken on the Swiss side. Then they were moved to detention camps such as Beatenberg, and my father remembers
עד השאר, סיפרתי להם בי אנחנו, מאיפה אנחנו.
In Switzerland, we were sent to an army officers' hospital for treatment, and after a few weeks of medical treatment, to a health resort in Beatenberg. As we had asked to be sent to Eretz Yisrael, the Swiss authorities contacted the British authorities and obtained immigration permits for me and my brother.
Here is a picture of the group probably taken at this camp of Beatenberg. We also received a bunch of official forms such as refugee ID application, findings of the camp doctors, various check-in and check-out forms from detention camps they have been moved to. At last, but not least, once more, this time, with the right to publish the 9-page report of my father and uncle given to the Association of Swiss Jewish Refugee Aid and Welfare Organization, in which he reviews painful time in the ghettos, forced labor camps, and death camps, and their miraculous journey ending with their liberation. Although my father and my uncle were granted a residence permit in Switzerland, they wanted to continue their journey to Israel, then Palestine under British mandate, together with their inmates, as Moses Shapiro stated.
I believe that I was only able to endure all those terrible years thanks to my physical resilience. I was an excellent worker, so I could be used everywhere for the heaviest work. For example, I carried 3 bags of cement on my back. Today, having already recovered in Switzerland, I am completely exhausted. The biggest luck for me was that I was able to save my younger brother Meir, now 17 years old. He was in my group the whole time, and he too had made it through thanks to his strong constitution and ability to work. It is God's miracle that I was able to keep him with me, and thus see the only one of my family saved. All 9 of us comrades are going to Palestine because our lives would no longer be bearable in the many countries of Europe. We want to live among Jews.
They left Switzerland on August 16, 1945, direction of Barcelona, from where they embarked to Palestine, Israel. Finally, they started a new life as free people and were able to start a family. What my grandfather wisely planned, namely, to give my father the gold coins just in case, was ultimately my father and uncle's most important key to freedom in life. The last gold coin was given by my father to an SS guard in Dachau for a loaf of bread, and that SS guard was the one who helped them escape the death march. In this case, processing with the dogged persistence of this history has shown that even more than 80 years after the greatest catastrophe in Jewish history, it is possible, with the help of archives, to find evidence. Only a few succeeded in coming to terms with their Holocaust history. Millions of others left behind, at best, a name and number on their arm, and perhaps the confirmation of a friend or relative that they had lived and been murdered. It is said that the Holocaust is probably the best documented event in world history. This film is a contribution to it and might encourage other families who were afflicted by the Holocaust to trace and unlock more details about their history, enabling them to tell and teach future generations. A few days ago, we read the Pesach Haggadah, which gives us details on the exodus of oppressed Jewish people in Egypt. With all these new documented facts, our family has received an invaluable jewel for their family safe, their own Haggadah, to be read once a year from generation to generation.